Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. My name is Mateusz Pietraszek. I work at Universidad Francisco de Vitoria in Madrid, and today I'm talking to you about negative feedback acceptability among university-level English learners in Spain. Now, this bar at the bottom is going to disappear soon. In this talk, well, first, probably the most important thing here is that we need to introduce some basic notions related to feedback types, feedback preferences, previous studies regarding those, but also some intercultural differences, because as you're going to see, my research kind of derives from my readings on intercultural differences. And then we're going to delve into deeper into the study, its design. We're going to take a look at the results, and we're going to conclude. So the first thing is that, well, there are many different, feedback classifications, and a lot of things have been written on feedback. Normally, direct and indirect feedback in ELT is described or defined like this. So direct feedback, for example, in writing shows the correct form. No correction is given in indirect feedback, and that's important for us to understand that I'm going to talk about direct and indirect feedback from the multi or intercultural perspective, and that's going to be different. Now, when it comes to the effectiveness of feedback, there have been loads of studies. There was also this interesting debate here mentioned at the very beginning where certain people defended no feedback at all was useful, that was written feedback, while other people obviously defended that it was, and so on and so forth. We're teachers, we need to correct people. So, well, that was a very interesting debate. But indeed, there is a lot of research that says that feedback is indeed effective, and also research that shows what kind of feedback is effective. Okay, so here, for example, recasts, which, well, teachers like so much, are ineffective. Okay, explicit feedback, corrective. So direct feedback, this is about oral feedback, so we're talking about explicit, not direct feedback. That's more effective. Okay, and well, overall, this meta-analysis, for example, from 2010 by Lee showed overall medium effectiveness of feedback. So feedback's definitely an effective thing. We should do it as teachers. Okay. There is also some research about feedback preferences and the attitudes to feedback, and we're going to see that most students want to be corrected, and they believe that feedback is, efficient. They expect it. Okay. At the same time, there are some interesting studies that say that there may be, some inconsistencies between what teachers report to do and what they actually do in class. And I wouldn't discard that there are also differences between, what people report to like and what they actually like and how that makes them feel. Okay. So that is interesting. There are also some research with specific language groups or cultural groups. Okay, so for example, Thai students prefer direct metalinguistic feedback. Okay, Chinese students also want to be corrected because people basically want to be corrected. Okay, this study in Canada with many nationalities shows that people want to be corrected by the teacher and not so much about their peers. And well, we like peer feedback and peer correction and so on. And well, I could go on and on about this, but the research is there. Okay, so I just wanted to mention some of it. At the same time, we should know that English is spoken as a global language. You've got some data here. This is relevant because we shouldn't just assume that giving feedback to everybody around the globe when teaching English should happen in the same way. Okay, in Spain, for example, we've got so many bilingual programs. And well, sometimes we can also have people who come from another country, from a different country, not necessarily from an English-speaking country, and they're going to probably just give feedback the same way as they were given feedback at their university, and that's not always the best solution. Okay, although today's session is not going to answer the question of how to give feedback, because that requires some further research. I hope that you at least reflect on it, or based on the data I'm going to present. And then, well, from the international perspective, there are cultures that like to give direct negative feedback and indirect negative feedback. Let's not forget that, well, at school, we're talking about feedback. Obviously, there is positive feedback, and we should give it. But, well, this study is centered around and well, it revolves around negative feedback. So, in those direct cultures, people are direct, frank, honest. The feedback can be blunt. It's often, categorical. It may be in public, okay, not softened. So this is one pole, okay, one end of the spectrum. And then on the other end, there would be this indirect feedback, which is soft, subtle, diplomatic, like this sandwich style. I'm going to tell you something good, and then I'm going to give you the negative news, the bad news. We use softening language. It's very often only private, but there is a lot here in between, okay, these two poles, so to say. So I really like this meme. It's just a version thereof. So when a British person say, perhaps you could give this some more thought, well, the British meme is, don't do it, it's a bad idea, okay? A Dutch person from a very direct negative feedback culture is likely to think that it's a good idea, keep developing it. If you don't want me to develop it, just say it, okay? But people don't always do that, okay? As you can see that this is from Meyer 2015. You can see that Spain, for example, is much more direct from the English-speaking countries, the two main English-speaking countries, when giving feedback. And here we've got a comparison of, some other English-speaking countries. So Ireland is more indirect, and Australia is the most direct of all. Okay, but also if we take a look at some Asian countries, extremely indirect, and this is something that, well, many people do not take into account. But Spain is actually much more direct than most Latin American countries. So Brazil, Mexico. I think that Colombia is also here, and Venezuela. Okay. Another thing that we should mention is that being, explicit when giving direct feedback does not mean that you're actually explicit when communicating. So, well, there is this idea based on Hall 1976 that there are cultures that where you need to read between the lines. Like, for example, in Spain, you need to read between the lines. But if I want to be negative, then I'm going to be quite clear about this. In the US, for example, you don't have to read between the lines. They're going to give you all the instructions very, very clearly, but they're not going to be so straightforward when it comes to, negative feedback. And here again, we can see that there is a difference between Europe and the English-speaking countries, the main ones, and also between Europe and Latin America, which is very interesting. I'm saying this because I've got loads of Latin American students, and you can see that they're much more indirect when giving bad news, okay? But they may be slightly more direct for other things, okay, as on this, explicitness, the score higher here. Anyway, in this study, this is a preliminary study, a quantitative account of Spanish students' preferences regarding negative feedback and their views on its acceptability. Okay, so what are the students' preferences? That's research question number 1. What's the level of reported tolerance of negative feedback in private and in public? How do students perceive specific general negative feedback formulations in terms of their directness and acceptability? Okay, and are there any gender differences? And we're going to see later on that there might be. Okay, so 100 native speakers of Spanish took part in this in this research at this stage, with 35 males, 58 females, and 7 people didn't disclose their gender, or they stated to be non-binary, or they stated to be or they'd say that they prefer not to say. Their average age is here. These are the average English levels. So you can see many of them, most of them, the vast majority were quite advanced, and they came from many different degrees. Okay, the instrument was a questionnaire which consisted of 18 Likert type items to measure the general preferences regarding negative feedback. Then there were 8 semantic differential scales. Negative feedback on written regarding negative feedback on written and oral tasks, and then semantic differential scales to evaluate examples of written feedback in terms of directness and acceptability. And here we've got some variables that we're going to touch upon, but they've already appeared and they're going to become apparent later on. The items, for example, just so you know that the Likert type items were labeled like this, from strongly agree to strongly disagree. Then, well, the other items, the semantic differential scales, were indirect to direct, unhelpful to helpful, unacceptable to acceptable. So the negative end was always 1. Okay. And let's go to the results. Okay, so the average student in the sample, okay, somewhat agrees that teachers should be direct when conveying negative feedback. This is the score, okay, out of 6, but is undecided whether they're okay or not with public criticism, especially, okay. However, still, they do not disagree with public criticism. They consider criticism to be rather constructive, okay, although depending on other variables, we're going to see that not always, and they consider private feedback to be the most helpful kind of feedback. You can see that those scores here were very high. So now there were some statistically significant differences between the types of feedback. As you can see, well, criticism in private should not be avoided, okay, and criticism public should be avoided. Basically, there was a statistically significant difference in the answers to these two. Also, in terms of how constructive, feedback is perceived to be, well, private is much more constructive than public. So there is a difference between these two dimensions, private versus public. Okay, and you can see that there is also a slight difference. It's okay to give oral negative feedback, or public negative feedback for oral assessment is much more. It's slightly more accepted than for written assessment, okay? But on average, private feedback helpfulness is much better evaluated than public feedback helpfulness. And here we've got the different types of tasks. So again, well, you can see that if it's an oral task, then it's okay for you to criticize me. Slightly more okay than if it's a written assignment, okay? Which is fairly understandable, okay? And in general, here, for example, there is very little difference. Oral feedback for oral task in public helpfulness. How helpful is that? Okay. And oral feedback for written task in public helpfulness. So this is basically the same story. Now, overall written versus oral feedback, there is no clear preference here. Okay. So both oral and written feedback are useful. When it comes to directness and acceptability of the different types of feedback, you can see the statements that they were supposed to evaluate. This is interesting. So while some of them were direct, more direct than others, well, you can see the directness out of 6 evaluations and their helpfulness. And then if you just look at the graph, you're going to see that this graph kind of, mirrors this one on the right, mirrors this one. So this would be the directness, this would be the acceptability. So on average, those that were considered more indirect were more acceptable than those that were considered on average as more direct. And we're referring to the statements here on this page. Okay. There were also differences detected between males and females. So as you can see, there is no difference here, and I think criticism in private is constructive, but in public there is a difference. Okay, and overall criticism is a difference. So females tend to evaluate this as less, as less constructive, and also there is a difference between public criticism where males score a 3.9 and females a 3, so they don't like it. But overall, okay, there is a certain tendency for males to say that they're okay with criticism and with feedback, even if it's, public. I'm okay with my work criticizing class. Look at the difference between males and females. So what are the conclusions here? Okay, now preliminary conclusions, okay, that there is a clear preference for private over public feedback, that there is no clear preference, when it comes to written and oral feedback, they're both okay. For written and oral tasks, there is more tolerance of public negative feedback on oral tasks, okay, like a presentation, that indirect feedback is more acceptable, and that males report more indifference to criticism than females, especially in public. Now, there is some information here. Okay, obviously, the next step is to compare these Spanish results with indirect, or more, sandwichy countries. Okay, like England. Okay, are there any differences in the directness measures? Okay, because if we look at some of those items were kind of, rude and impolite, and people still wouldn't treat them as, so unacceptable. Okay, there were probably, so all those things are still to be seen. Okay, so are there any differences in the acceptability judgments? Are there any relationships between the two? What are the relationships? or the differences in the relationships between the two in other cultures. Okay, and then well, it has maybe even practical ramifications, because I do think that some teachers sometimes may require intercultural training for teachers. Not only to protect the sensitive, because you don't want to be too direct if the culture that you're teaching is not so direct, but also not to overdo positive feedback, because to some people it might sound fake. But all of that is still something that well, I need to do further research on. And then, well, the answer, to why are men more indifferent? Why do men report to be more indifferent? This is something that that I've been asking myself, because I've already received, similar results. Okay, because I do think that there might be a mismatch between what's reported and what the actual emotions are. Okay, but yeah, those are only speculations, so I would just leave you with some of those reflections. If you can point me in any direction, that would be great. So thank you very much for your attention, and well, this is the list of references, and I'm waiting for your comments.